talking here about safety, privacy, and ethical design in XR. And our panelists are Peta Estens, who is Director of Operations for Pangaea Mines and the Director of XR Citizenship and Education for the XR Safety Initiative, the XRSI, which is a really important organization in this space. And we also have Rolando Masís-Obando, who's a neuroscientist and a filmmaker from Princeton University. I am really inspired by what I saw, what I know, and what was shared with me in the run-up to this panel. The topics are deep and rich, and so I think we should probably just try to dive right into it and get started, because we do only have a half an hour. So I want to start by sort of taking a look at the big picture and on the bright side. And I was struck by something that Peta wrote that said, XR shifts humanity from using technologies as tools for teaching and learning, and instead we merge with it. We don't use XR, we embody the experience, and that's why it is powerful. Would you please expand on that and tell us what it is about the potential and promise of XR, not just for education, but for humanity as a whole, and why?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It is an interesting question, and embodiment and extended reality, it's kind of been hijacked as though it's a new phenomenon, and it's to do with like head-mounted display units and wearable technologies. But embodiment is as old as the ancient of civilization. So in Australia, First Nations people, for instance, there's a ritual called a corroboree, and technologies like the didgeridoo, as an example, were used for a transcendence experience, to retell stories of the dream time. And part of that was, education for their next generations to understand the stories and way of life. So it's not new, but I'm not going to fight the battle about XR being, it's just different. Let's say that it's evolving. So we do think today of extended reality as hardware. But extended reality and embodiment, it's not hardware, it's the experience. So if I come back to the question about what is the potential and promise for extended reality in education, I think we really have to, as educators, think about traditional media and who are the composers of this experience, who is the intended audience for this experience, and what is the purpose? Because when we deconstruct literature or poetry or film, they're the kind of starting points. Who is the author? What is the context? What is the purpose? And what is the audience? Who is the audience? And in education, I think that we're at risk of losing that basic literacy. So before we plunge students into extended reality experiences, we need to give them the literacy to be empowered to deconstruct that experience. The possibilities that excite me is the ability to, for the first time, illustrate complex three-dimensional illustrations that were previously inconceivable. So physics and maths that are, we're used to 2D formats. We can now illustrate these really complex concepts in ways that students can immediately identify with, play with, and interact with. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. That's like that's beautiful. I mean, like when we go from like the 2D screens, right? We had like, we move a mouse, we click on things, and maybe if we're playing a game, there's 3D things happening. But the difference of like XR technologies, as Peter just like beautifully illustrated, is like, well, first of all, it's like we're merging. It's not just a tool, right? Like we're like inside code, like 3D objects. We are now incarnated into a 3D object as well, and we're moving around in 3D space. We're moving around in code, and like also I like what Peter said about like the embodiment being like just like an old idea and like a thing that's like so true, and like I agree with that so much. I mean, for example, like humans have been augmenting ourselves since the dawn of time, right? We see a tool, like we use natural tools, sticks to dig, our hands, and even our brain literally lights up when it like sees tools. There's like a spot in the brain that literally like starts to like tingle every time that we see a tool. And so we've constantly been augmenting ourselves. You know, we've created cars with wheels so that we can travel longer distances. Our phones, we carry them in our pockets constantly. Like at least in like many of the developed countries, we literally just carry this phone everywhere. And it just feels sometimes that XR is sort of this like natural next type of augmentation.
I want to pick up on that, and it's a later question that, you know, sorry, Karen. We have with students, like when we ask them to give them us out their phones in the classroom or to close their laptops, it's like we're asking them to give away part of their body, like you know, to get that resistance, right? So that's a real key question for this panel is, you know, we're looking at the ethics and what it is to be human as we increasingly embody technology as we can't, like, as a necessity for education, for learning, for entertainment. Then we have to ask questions about to what extent that is an existential crisis, you know, about what it is to be human.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. Yes. This is great. This is fantastic. I love it. I want to move on to ask about when XR tools are used for education. That can obviously be a good thing, but there are certain dangers, and some of them are with regard to the collection of data about a person using those tools. We already give away a lot of data, you know, on our phones, on our computers. How is this different? You know, let's think about the nature of the data that's being collected and what the collection of it implies. What do you two have to say about this? And let's start with Peta.
Yeah, sure. Look, schools are at risk of violating a child's right, human right. So Article 16 of the UNICEF's child's right actually reads that children have the right to privacy. They need to be protected from attacks against their way of life, their good name, their family, and their home. Now, presence and immersion are often used interchangeably, but they are very different. So to be immersed is a sensory experience. And when we're fully immersed, it's a complete sensory experience. Now, this technology has to track and trace to work. If there's lag or low fidelity, we experience simulator sickness. So increasingly, this high fidelity is tracking and tracing the most fine details of the body, the sensory experience. Now, presence is a psychological experience of the mind. So if we consider the kind of data that's being tracked and traced, it is all encompassing. My concern with XR is that this data is being harvested. It's commonly known as biometric data. And Australia, and indeed around the world, we haven't got it right. This legislation and regulation is being reformed, and it is not being reformed at the pace that technology is infiltrating every way that we live. So if you go to a doctor in Australia and most parts of the world and ask for your retina to be checked or your hearing to be checked, there are laws and regulations that lock that down, okay, and it is safe. But any child can go into a store and buy an Oculus, and the technology is as invasive. So that's quite, schools are at risk of using these technologies in ways before they understand how the data may be being harvested. That data can be used in predictive ways. So it's not capturing the most sensitive data in an isolated context. The idea of, well, we're just using it in education. That data can be used to make strong inferences about that child for the rest of their life.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and like and I can only speak for like what I know about the United States, right? But I think that in the United States we have FERPA, right? Like the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and in it, it allows under like the school official exception, it allows like third parties to get access to education records and to modify them if that third party has a legitimate educational it is of educational interest, legitimate educational interest. And so what that means is that, schools, as Spita brought up earlier, they're not always advancing as quickly as the technology, and so there's a delay in adoption. So there's going to be a lot of third parties that are going to be managing and handling most of the XR technology and like the sort of educational systems and platforms that institutions then use. That means that these, at least in the United States, these would be third-party agencies that fall under the school official exception, which means that they would have access to the data, to the education records of students. And so we have to start thinking about how we really handle that information and like what it is that we decide to handle. How much of that information, like as Peter said, like it's just as invasive as sometimes going to a doctor. If there's eye tracking, we can actually start predicting people's uncertainty just by the way that they're moving their eyes. So it's a very sensitive subject, and I would agree that it's important to watch out for how we handle this, especially with kids in education before they're 18, even after. And since we're talking about education, before they're 18.
So, and if we think about education, it's one of the poorest funded sectors if we compare it to defense and health and stuff. So,
Yeah.
So you think about extended reality technologies, and if I can say that Oculus has pretty much got a monopoly on it, if that's a personal statement, like it's driving it, owned by Facebook, and Facebook's business model is on data. Like, so if Oculus was purchased by Meta for $1.6 billion, I think it is, and it's invested 10 billions more on developing the hardware, 10 times the money. They're not making, they're not thinking they're going to make, $20 billion on selling a headset. It's not about the hardware. It's about the data. Now, that is a huge concern, because the kind of data, it's not clickbait anymore. It is a sensory experience, and it is a psychological experience. So for the first time, humanity has moved into a space where we can, in real time, do Pavlovian experiments.
Yeah.
Widespread, all around the world.
Real-time A/B testing.
So my concern is as an architect now in XR, and I work as a subcontractor, and so I'm developing extended reality experiences for childcare, education, for music performance, for hospital and tourism. So it won't be enough, I believe, it won't be enough in the future to pass the XR and say, look, you're competent. We can now harvest data about your retina expanding, your blood pressure, your heart rate, any kind of lag, sweat. So we can measure the stress of an individual as they complete a task. And that can be really useful for, predictive PTSD, burnout. So are we looking at a future where it won't be enough for you to be competent at the skill? Will you potentially be denied a role because of the stress you're under? And I don't know, like there's just so much data in XR.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably going to be a really deep issue for commercial products that don't apply to education, because hopefully, right, like the government that's probably going to handle the funding for schools is going to have policies that make sure that any data that actually ends up being used by that third party is actually de-anonymized. And so there's like the local, and then there's like the not local, right? Like local algorithms that work and contain data that should stay within the school. Then there's like the data that might go up to the server for the third party so that they can do their metrics, their algorithms, and do testing and training or whatever. That should definitely be anonymized. It should be de-identified and anonymized.
Completely, but a child, not just anonymized, but a child should decide if it goes to a cloud at all. Like, the power to the person, rather than have a blanket, yeah, we're taking that data, it's useful to solve really complex issues.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also, I guess, concerned about people selling their data out of need, out of like economic need. If we go down the path that, well, you've got your right to privacy, and so now we've got a blanket law that people have to buy your data, well, we're going to end up with data sets that are biased and making uninformed decisions. So it is a really, we don't have the answers, but we are entering into a really exciting time. Don't know if you have heard of Glenn Gore, GLENN He left Amazon. Really interesting guy who's trying to flip the model of data ownership so that instead of logging into Amazon or logging into your account, they have to log into you so that you own it. So he left Amazon and he started a thing, an organization called Affinity, AFFINIDI. Now, why I raise him is he spoke at a conference I attended at the Gold Coast, talked about really the evolution of power and how, like, long before there was a tribe, we had a chief. Oh, sorry, a patriarchy. There was a patriarchal unit. We moved to a tribe and there was a kind of a chief. When we had unification of areas, we had little fiefdoms which became kingdoms, and from kingdoms came the rule of law. So when we had maybe a murder or some sort of a crime, a king went, well, what did we, and it happened over here, we went, well, what was the punishment over there? What did we do? How do we deal with it? And they went, well, that's what we'll do here. So then we have this sovereign rule. And he said, we're entering an age of the rule of code where we agree to terms and conditions, and we are bound by code. And
Social
I found
contract.
that a social contract. That's right. And so as educators, where in the curriculum are we helping support students to govern the rule of code? And are we even asking questions about how comfortable we are with that?
Well, an important question. Yes. Let's skip to this issue of ethical design, and how does this concept of ethical design for education feature into the use of XR and AI, and whose responsibility is it to design educational experiences, courses, programs using XR or NXR in an ethical manner? Where does that burden of responsibility fall? And what does the ethical design look like?
You want to jump on that, Roland? I've spoken a lot.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's I think that the XR is going to bring a lot of opportunity for people, a lot of new jobs. I think that it's for current educators, there's going to be an onboarding process for them to learn the technology, and we're still waiting for more platforms to start doing no code type of building for XR experiences to make it easier and like not as hard to build an XR experience for the classroom. So that's going to take some time. And even when we do have that, there's going to be job opportunities, I feel, for actual just ethical designers, or courses and classes for ethical design, where there's maybe some central authority agency that's funded by the government that, it kind of acts like as a sort of ethics review board, but a sort of like modern sci-fi-ish review board that actually knows how to make these experiences. Because for this kind of stuff, it's not just enough to know aesthetics and sort of just design principles. You actually have to know a little bit about how data moves around. So it's a little bit deeper. And I feel like that's where the responsibility should fall. We should not expect teachers to all of a sudden know exactly what to do. That's too much, and like that's not what they were trained for. At least not right now. I think that in the future that should probably be included in sort of the education of when people are learning how to teach and getting those degrees. But I was also going to say that in terms of like ethical design, I had a conversation with someone who said like something around the lines of, it's so weird to me that they call it ethical design. It used to be just called design. But I think there is a difference now with design as it was called and like what ethical design really means, because now there's a sort of more cultural awareness of what ethics how it should be included in design. We don't want a button to be clicked on just because it's more contrastive than another button, which is what happens when you like to see the big buttons and you want to subscribe on something, right? That it's the highlight, the spotlight effect of that makes you want to click it because it pulls your attention. That's not the type of design I'm talking about. I'm talking about ethical design where like, is it actually correct to lure people into that button, right? Is that what we want? And so when thinking about XR experiences, maybe something we need to ask ourselves is the idea of like what is necessary versus what is sufficient, right? Is collecting eye tracking in the educational context necessary for a task that involves a group activity, right? So if it is, then we need to ask ourselves, why? Why is it necessary? And if it's not, then what else can we get that is also sufficient? What other methods are sufficient, right? So when we have some of these candidates, we should always choose the least invasive one.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Absolutely. The least invasive. It's a really good way to come away from today, I think, is a great way to summarize technology and the way we're using it today. If I think about ethical design in the classroom, it's just, we have to remember it's a new media. It's a new medium. It's media evolving. And so we don't need necessarily to look for brand new strategies. We've had strategies for ethical design that have proven to work.
Yeah.
So if I think about unethical, then there are texts that have been banned in schools because they've been considered unethical. Philip Pullman's The Northern Lights and the Golden Circle comes to mind as an example. It's a book that's banned because it's considered unethical as it attacks religion, Christian religion in particular. So it's banned because, if I come back to what I started with, the purpose of that book was to provoke thought about souls and spirituality through a wonderful fantasy novel. And the composer, if we learn about his life, we see what inspired him to write. The purpose of the book is for children to think about their faith, their spirituality, and their souls in a delightful tale. We need to apply these same strategies with XR. What is the purpose of this XR? Who is designing it? And in what context does it belong? And give students the literacy to deconstruct that. Things like affordances, situational awareness, cues, how I've got user agency. And if they start thinking about this new terminology, we're empowering them not to be passive consumers and instead be critical citizens of XR. So there is a huge gap in the curriculum. There's an opportunity. I really should do more writing and use my background as an English literature teacher and analyzing and film and bring that in so students have the creativity and critical thinking skills to be able to critique and think deeply about. I think there's still too much of a wow factor. Teachers too often are like, don't understand the tech, so overworked all around the world. One of the reasons I left teaching, in fact, was just the bureaucracy and the paperwork. So we tend to go, oh, there's technology. Yeah, it's filling a gap. We're falling into play with the tech, create first. It's novel. See what you can do with it. Human-centered design is ethical design. So if we teach students 100%. We don't say, okay, write a story, just go for it. Write a story, write an essay. We're all about planning. Think about your ideas. What are your arguments? Where is the evidence? And so we need to be doing that with XR. And the key point is, who is your intended audience? Who are you designing for? What is the purpose of your design? And who are you designing with? And to think deeply about those things in your design before you create, before you play. And if we have students start designing for clearly identified people with clearly identified purpose, then when they're receiving an XR experience, they're embodying an XR experience. If they've thought about human-centered design principles, they're more likely to be able to come away from XR and reflect on deeper issues instead of just the novelty of what they've encountered.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would also plug in, like, I feel it's also important for people to maybe just look at the psychology, the literature of how people react and interact with environments, because that's going to inform often how people end up doing something, right? In science, like there's hypothesis-based testing, and you either prove or don't prove like your hypothesis, right? So if we start grabbing some of like the little gold nuggets that we find in some of these experiments that actually try to uncover some of the nuances in XR or in other types of digital experiences, then we can start like spreading that knowledge and having ethical designers really ask themselves those questions, but at least know a little bit or have some hypothesis of how people are going to react based on their question asking to themselves. So yeah, totally agree.
Wow. The time has flown by here. We just have a few minutes left, but I want to get to a question that I had about, we're getting very philosophical here. So I want to ask you to think about not just these specific technologies, but about our use in technology in general and how it shapes us and changes us, gives us new capabilities and changes our relationships to the world and to one another.
There's a great chapter in Experience on Demand by Jeremy Bailenson. You are what you eat. So XR, the more well, I think that says it all, right? You are what you eat. Choose your XR wisely. Yeah. It shapes who you are. It's identity. This is your area, Rolando, memory, neuroscience, XR.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, just piggybacking off on what you said, we are what we eat. I feel like with technology sometimes, as also in like your previous point on just creating for creating's sake and not asking ourselves questions before creating. I feel with XR and like the way it can be used in education or with any other human at any age or any place, there has to be a reason why we are using this technology, like intentional utility, not utility because we can. And I think that is one of the sort of, I don't know how to say it, like a sort of core sort of ethos for how to approach what this technology has the power to do. Because if we just throw it at everything, then like we're not going to get anything out of it because it's just going to like turn into noise. We have to have intentional utility. Really think about how we approach and engage with this technology.
Yes, and I think that having events like this, bringing people together so that we can think intentionally together about what it is that we're doing and how we should move forward is really, really important. Rolando, thank you so much for being here today. Peta, many thanks to you as well. This was a great discussion. I really appreciate your time.
It really was. Yeah, eye-opening. Again, every single one just opens your eyes a little bit more, but this conversation has to keep happening. And we need to keep talking about it to learn from each other about what everybody's doing. Somebody in the chat just said data protection and privacy and education starts with procurement as well, right? So, I think this is where conversations just need to keep happening. We need to keep learning from what everybody's doing so that we can stay aligned and all follow the same rules.
Indeed.
And welcome to our other guests. Thank you so much for our previous guests. Welcome to the new ones.